Welcome to the Moulding Health Show. Our goal is to leverage the wisdom and experience of healthcare practitioners to set you on a path of self-discovery and healing. These insights, coupled with a multidisciplinary approach to each area of interest, should provide an invaluable resource to everyone looking for a better approach to health. In this episode of the show, we speak to Claire Haggard about gender identity from a clinical psychologist perspective. Claire Haggard, welcome to the show. So we're really glad to have you on board. And speaking about gender identity, interesting topic. So welcome on board.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here today.
It's always our pleasure. And I always ask this question, firstly, because I'm always curious on the topic. And it sounds weird because some of the times, I just see the invite come in from Shaz. And secondly, knowing how the practitioner actually started with that area of interest. So Shaz, how did you meet Claire?
So to be fair, I've probably been connected to Claire on LinkedIn for a while now, but having recently started exploring my own sort of gender and gender identity, I kind of put the invite, kind of put feelers out to see who was interested or specialized in that field. And Claire's name popped up a couple of times. So I sent her the invite and she was really keen to come on board. I think we also chatted about another topic for down the line. So yeah, it was just really coincidental that we happened to meet up with each other at almost the right time in our lives, I guess.
Thanks. And thanks, Claire, for agreeing.
Pleasure. I mean, it's interesting because I suspect that Shaz, I seem to think that on LinkedIn, I may have actually got some commentary from you, Shaz, on an article that I wrote, I think during COVID and racial identity and Black Lives Matter, I think something along those. And I think that's where I first became aware of you as a presence on my LinkedIn, because I connect with people, but I'm not always clear who I'm connecting with always. I sometimes like to explore and check out, but certainly that was where you came onto my radar as well. Yeah.
So Claire, in terms of gender identity, tell us, how did you even get started with that area of interest? Is it something new, or is it just me that it seems to be coming up a lot more often now?
I think possibly it's coming up a lot more because it feels to me like, I think it's interesting because I've been thinking a lot about historical moments in time and what they potentially allow for. And I've been thinking a lot about the pandemic and, there's been kind of the last 2 years, not to say that gender identity has just come up in the last 2 years, because certainly it hasn't, but I've been struck that more so than ever, I think a global community has been confronted with the fact that binaries and kind of the neatly sort of contained ways in which we make sense of the world, as in black and white terms, that so much of what is happening just doesn't really conform to that, and that there is a lot more chaos in life, and that there is a lot more kind of variability in terms of how things unfold, who we are as humans, and that some of those binary structures are things that we use to keep ourselves safe. So, gender identity is something that I think I've always been interested in identity, if I can start there. And the self, and the fact that as individuals we are just we've got this kind of multiplicity of aspects to ourselves, and certainly when it comes to gender, I think because gender is quite a subjective experience, it's more about our subjective felt sense of who we are. It's our kind of internal, deeply held sense of identity that I think it became an area of interest for me, specifically because I was working in a student context. So I was working in higher education, and of course then working with an age bracket from sort of 18 to anywhere up to 30, 35, postgraduate students as well. So I was working in counselling centres, primary healthcare units. I worked at Stellenbosch University and then UCT. And I think my first introduction to gender identity was really being asked to run a support group for young females who were questioning their identity, specifically their sexual identity, possibly also gender identity. And I think I've always really enjoyed working with idiosyncratic expressions of self as well. And I think, unfortunately, when it comes to gender identity, often some of the less kind of heteronormative manifestations of gender identity are often referred to as being other or different or somehow quite idiosyncratic, right? So I really enjoy the idea of inclusivity and really kind of creating meaning within those contexts, because I'm struck that often individuals who are on the outskirts of the sort of majority often do experience a sense of, just there's not really a lot of space to be able to process and integrate and create meaning, or even create networks and communities. So I became really interested in, I guess, gender identity, but also then increasingly started getting students who came in who really were questioning their gender identity and even considering surgical procedures that might allow them to have a sort of more an external manifestation or be read in the ways that they felt internally. And I this sounds incredibly, it sounds a little bit kind of woohoo and sort of hippie-like, but at the same time, I do believe that we do get sent the clients that we need to work with. And so I have found over time that I get a lot of clients who are questioning their gender identity, and it felt somewhat like chance. And then I guess it became something that people then started to actually access me because they realized that this is something that I do work with. I'm not sure I'd call myself an expert though, because I'm struck that it's a space that is always evolving and always unfolding. And I think, it's as much a space of learning for me as it is for the person that I'm working with.
Claire, I love the way that you put that whole together, that, the right time, the right place, things just seem to fall into that specialty. You mentioned kind of the binary side of things and non-binary. So, having recently started exploring this side of things, there's the two binary genders, which is male and female, and then non-binary, they don't conform. Are there a number of other identity or gender identities that are out there, or are they more sexualities?
Well, I think gender identity is, because it's quite a complex and nuanced concept, I think we need to kind of really understand that I think also historically, and I think still at present, we tend to conflate kind of gender identity, sexual orientation, sex. We tend to kind of conflate these things. And there are a broad range of terms and also identities that refer to gender identity. You can have individuals who identify as transgender, as trans, as agender, as non-binary, as gender fluid, gender queer. So there's this very broad kind of spectrum of gender identity expression. And that's very different, I think, from also sexual identity, because this is really about one's personal, internally deeply held sense of your identity as female, male, both, neither, or as fluid between genders. So it's not determined by sex, it's not defined by one's sexual orientation. And so for many people, their gender identity may in fact match the sex that they were assigned at birth. But for others, their gender identity does not match that. And they may use a variety of terms to really describe how they position themselves along this very complex and very nuanced spectrum of gender identity.
I like how you introduced it when you said, actually, focus on identity, per se, and I'm trying, to see how we navigate through the topic, in probably the best way, and the way I can relate to it is probably to say that any identity issues is probably whether that's race or that's like a nationality. I always think of adoption. When children get adopted, there's an identity issue from a family point of view. So I think identity has always been with us. And so it's interesting for me because there's probably two ways, to this. One is how you identify, and then how the community or your circle around you, identifies with you.
Yes.
So I'm quite curious to understand, when this actually presents, does the person actually understand how that fits in? I mean, like, firstly, are they still trying to find what identity they are, and then kind of, trying to make sense of the world? Or is it that they already know, what their identity is, and they're trying to find a community that best they can belong to?
I mean, I think it's interesting because I sort of almost want to backtrack just a little slightly to the first part where you started the question, because I was thinking about how complex the expression of identity actually is. So, it's impossible for your expression of identity, whatever that is, to be divorced from the socially and culturally constructed roles and expressions that people in a society identify with and express to one another, right? So unfortunately also, there is this idea as well, I think, that when people come out, so when they start to really sort of try and embody how they identify themselves, whether that be in terms of gender identity or another form of identity, I think often there is a sense of people kind of feeling people around them, perhaps kind of feeling taken aback, or there's a sense of some people who are quite attuned to their children or their friends or may be aware. But I think it's quite interesting how a lot of how identity can or cannot be expressed is very, very much informed by the roles and identities that are sanctioned by a society or a culture. And we need to appreciate that some are more sanctioned than others still to this day, and are often indicative of the ideological underpinnings of that society. And I'm sorry to take it here, because I think people get quite frustrated when things take a little bit of a sort of political edge, but that's not really where I'm going. I'm just trying to sort of highlight that the things that we assume are natural and normal, or sort of natural expressions of, that we need to understand that any of our societal assumptions and customs around sexuality and gender often are much, they always kind of, and I think have always been in tension with the ways many people actually lead their lives. So historically, much of how we make sense of the world and our subjective expressions of identity have been much more sort of reinforced by these categories that we have around, kind of more normative categories of what it means to be a man or a woman, or black or white, or working class or middle class. So in a binary system, which is how we typically do make sense of things still, straight people would be defined as not gay. Masculinity only has meaning as the opposite of femininity, and girls are obviously understood in comparison to those assigned, in comparison to those that are assigned to boys. So their behaviors, preferences, and characteristics are then viewed in comparison to. And so it's not an expression of what is natural, but it's an expression of how binary systems actually work strategically to position dominant groups in society as those that embody more valued traits, whilst those that are established as sort of different or other are often defined as their opposites, and are always and often associated with less valued traits. So we need to understand that's a very important part of thinking around gender identity, or around any identity. And so with that in mind, kind of whether somebody expresses a knowing of their gender identity may also be an expression of what information has been available to them, what the environment mirrors to them, what is given to them, what is allowed, what is not allowed. And so you often have the sense with clients that they have had an internal sense of their gender identity for far longer than when they do finally come out. And I'm struck, I don't want to generalize, but what I do notice is that a lot of my clients who have come or presented for therapeutic support, often are either in kind of like early adulthood, perhaps sort of late adolescence, which I think is also developmentally quite appropriate, because it's a time where you're starting to engage in the sort of your central kind of identity conflict is around sort of, who am I in relation to my peers, in relation to my family? And so there's this process of separating out as an individual in some ways, and the striving towards that. And so often that's a time where I think pressures around who I am and who I really am, authentically am, versus who I need to be in particular spaces, often will then come into conflict. And so people come into therapy from a space of really wanting to explore whether or not or how they may want to access and possibly kind of, what's the word, I guess, bring or facilitate the emergence of more genuine ways of being in the world, things that feel more congruent, more authentic.
Yeah, I really love the way you put that of who am I and how do I fit in? And more than anything on the identity thing is it could be from a religious standpoint of, do I identify the same way as my family and peers from a religious perspective, or, like you mentioned, racial identity. Somebody could identify more towards one than the other, but we're so brought up with these binary factors of it's A or it's B, and there is no in between. So it makes sense that youngsters in their late teens, early 20s, who are now trying to establish themselves as a person, would start exploring these different options outside of the structure that they've been brought up with. So I know you mentioned the youngsters, but in my circles, I'm seeing a lot more people kind of in their 40s, early 40s to almost mid 50s, kind of also making these changes amongst themselves, whether it be from a racial identity or a gender identity, oftentimes a religious identity, no longer. The best example I can think of is a friend of mine was brought up as Hasidic Jew and has kind of gone, but I don't identify as a Hasidic Jew. I'm still believe in all the Jewish holidays, but not quite as strongly as the rest of my family. So he's kind of pulling away there, which is his own identity that he's trying to establish. I mean, he's in his mid 40s now.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I think, and isn't this the really interesting thing about us as human selves, is that we deeply internalize very particular rules of engagement, and it's often geared towards our sense of inclusion or forming a part of a family group or a community. And of course, there are implicit or explicitly stated rules around what that kind of staying connected to, staying a part of, what that entails. And it may not be that those rules of engagement are necessarily kind of black or white and without any kind of room for empathic exploration and change. But we fear what it means to separate out from that which we understand as being the sort of original kind of membership, or our sense of, these are my people, this is who I'm attached to. And what does it mean to then establish myself as separate, and potentially to also challenge some of those things that, have been so deeply accepted or have just come as so natural and such a sort of seemingly embodied part of. And when I'm kind of going, but this doesn't match with I don't embody this, or I don't resonate with this. The fear around rejection or abandonment or, ridicule or whatever it might be can be so powerful that it can prevent people from feeling able to voice things. And so I'm struck that also often later in life, I guess, as we head towards, I guess, I'm very wary of this midlife crisis thing, but if one thinks about the idea that you're moving steadily towards the finitude of your life, in the sense that midlife, whatever that is, you're moving towards another portion of your life, that's also a very big developmental shift in which people often are starting to have and ask the questions around, well, what does it mean to live genuinely and authentically? What does it mean to show up as myself? And am I satisfied with the person and with how I manifest in my broader circles? Am I feeling a measure of conflict around that? And so often there's a measure of, I guess I always feel a measure of hope when somebody at any point starts to engage authentically with themselves, because that excites me. But I also, there's a sense of grief and loss often attached with that I've lived my life according to these particular kind of sanctions, when in fact I've wanted to be very different for a very long time, So I'm not surprised that in 40s, 50s, that people also are coming to this. And I think I must say, I do want to qualify that I tend to get younger people, because I've worked with young adults and sort of, for probably about 11 years. I was in that setting for about 11 years. I think that's probably why the cross-section of people that I see is also, in some ways determined by that. But Shaz, I think you make such a valid point, an important one as well.
Yeah. So when Shaz said that, I couldn't help but think about it's almost like the space that we're in now, that it's no longer you fighting to survive, and you're almost like given this opportunity now to maybe think deeper about things. And it's exactly what you said now, Claire. Like midlife crisis is almost like this, this awareness of being better, or whatever that is, almost like self-reflection. And I just wonder, like a few generations back, where people were just barely surviving, they didn't really have the time to maybe think about these things, or even if they did, they had to brush it away because, actually, we just need to survive right now. Whereas I think that part, where we actually have that opportunity, and I think the whole openness of the world, via the internet, has opened up these communities to people that if you were interested in, I'm going to use a completely off-topic example, but you were interested in analog calculators, you could find like 10 people in the world that are interested and fascinated by analog calculators, and that's kind of the world that we're probably living in, and which is amazing to be in it. And I think it's amazing for people going through this, because they can, plug into those communities. But the word that you used, and I'm learning a lot more about this as we're doing the show, but that loss part, because I don't think we even had it in outline, but that loss of identity, that loss of family, the loss of community, that must be quite difficult to go through. Because I think as the person embarks on this, they lose that part. They're not going to connect with those people. They're not going to connect, maybe even sometimes with their family members. If we go back to, even the gay, straight type discussion, lots of people lose their families, once they come out. Do you find that as well?
I must say that, I think that a lot of individuals that I work with grapple through a process of, I think, that transitioning process, and transitioning not necessarily meaning coming out, but the transitioning process of transitioning from having kind of sort of felt that you've needed to, whether it's comply or whether it's that you've kind of embodied a very particular kind of reading of your gender identity in this case, and then kind of even internally some transitioning where you start to have the conversation of, but actually this is not really how I identify. I think even that process, I think is quite it can be quite isolating at times. I think especially if your environment, I think what I am struck by is, especially within family environments or community environments where there are very strong injunctions around religion, religious identity, cultural identity, and of course, also what it means to be a man or a woman. I think that people often experience a pronounced sense of fear and fear isolation. And I'm not sure that it's necessarily so misplaced, because sometimes the process of coming out and family members hearing this news, there is a sense of, there can be a sense of shock. There can also be a profound sense of loss on the part of family members as well, because remember, this is also a transition for them in the sense that they have been relating to, parents have, their baby is born and the sex is assigned to the baby by a medical professional, and then parents relate to their baby based on the sex that has been assigned, right? And so and whatever their fantasies are, whatever parents' fantasies are around what it means to be a little boy or a little girl, what it means to be a parent to a little boy, a little girl, and all of this stuff is often projected and played out in those spaces. And so there's a strong attachment and investment in your child's identity as you know them. And so when you are whether much later on in life, early on in life, I think often parents also experience a sense of the fear of what it means to have a child who may shift into embodying and taking up a gender identity that looks very different from what is familiar to them. Because of course, as human beings, we like familiarity. So we tend to want to cling to that. So even if the familiar is distressing, it's a language, it's a dance, it's an engagement that we know and that we understand. And I think this is one of the reasons why people often cling to or struggle to move from familiar places of distress. People often say, but I mean, if this is so terrible for you and it's so hard for you, then change it. But of course, it's not that simple because it's deeply interrelational, it's deeply interpersonal. And so there's a lot of there are a lot of consequences that kind of are married with what it means to potentially kind of start this process of transitioning and coming into being and coming out.
You said that amazingly well. Hey, I mean, I think, yeah, that's exactly what what it must be in terms of how difficult it is to make that change. And I think you use a critical word, change, because that's exactly what it is. And we know everyone hates that. It's like the one constant, but everyone hates change. There's very few people that don't. Even, I worked with someone, and even if you change his chair slightly, like if you just changed his, and it would completely derail him, for most of the day. It was just something as simple as that.
Yes.
But I worked with a colleague as well, and his little girl as in grade 12 or so, was going through the process. And I know, like, he was quite pragmatic, so he was kind of okay with it, but his wife struggled. And it's exactly what you just said now. It's like you know this person from the time they were in your arms or in your hands even, and now the child obviously would get quite emotional, if not angry, about the fact that they didn't recognize her in a different way. And it just doesn't happen like that. It wasn't like a switch that you just can kind of click. So yeah, I've felt for him and them going through that, but it was that whole loss, change, what you already articulated really well.
I guess what I am struck by is that, what is prejudice, right? Or any kind of negative, or it is the fear of that which is not known. It is the fear of the other. It is fear of, there is always some aspect, I think at least, of fear around the unknown, around what is uncertain. And I think what is really important is that I think it's very easy as well. Working with individuals who are grappling with gender identity, I'm struck that there are times where my human part kind of feels quite angry and upset at how some individuals in their outside world are responding, and the sense of othering that is taking place. My therapist part too, but my therapist part also is holding in mind that there is something around the importance of having compassion. Compassion doesn't necessarily mean being okay with aggressive expressions of othering or discrimination. That's not what I'm saying, but at least to try and attempt to understand where everybody is coming from, because what is so important is to locate the person that you're working with within their context and to facilitate really a working with that context. And sometimes part of the working with that context is also grieving the loss of the fantasy of how something was going to unfold in terms of how parents would receive the wish and the hope for a good welcoming and open kind of just at best a curious level of engagement, just curiosity. versus sometimes what happens, which can be a complete withdrawal or a shutdown or a kind of, a sort of quite emotive and reactive response. And I just think that we need to consider that our reactions to others' attempts to take up their differences and to risk expressing this may say a lot more about the fear that we experience of being kind of confronted with that which makes us feel uncomfortable, or also invites us to have to lean into holding that which feels unknown and uncertain. Because I think with gender identity, that process can be quite a complex, nuanced, quite intricate process of transitioning. It's not that I come out as identifying as trans female, for example, and that, I'm kind of, that there's not going to be some process of transitioning that may still take place. It's just as identity and self-development is an ongoing process. It is an ongoing process as we start to find the language that we feel comfortable with, how we may want to manifest physically. So there's a lot of uncertainty and not knowing that everybody is asked to tolerate. And as humans, we don't like that. I mean, I think we really struggle with that.
Claire, I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's that tolerance and understanding, and being in the community, there seems to be this idea that the rest of the world doesn't understand or doesn't tolerate. But if we go back to your example of a parent that has a baby that's assigned at birth, either male or female, there are certain wishes or hopes or dreams that a parent has for that little child. Whether if it's a little girl, daddy hopes to walk her down the aisle one day, or if it's a little boy, mom wants to have that first dance at a wedding. And when this identity change comes, yes, your child is still your child, but all of those dreams that you had as a parent, you do tend to grieve those losses. And it's not to say that the parent or the loved ones don't understand, but they're also grieving the loss of someone that they have brought up for a certain amount of time. But from, somebody who is kind of trying to figure out their identity and their gender, there are, I find, ways that you can start to bring the conversation up without alienating the people around you. And I think that's where that middle line lies, is realizing that although this is a change for the person trying to figure out their identity, it's also a change for everybody around them, whether that be work colleagues, schoolmates, friends, family. And we can't be upset when somebody doesn't refer to you by your new chosen name. I mean, I know when I changed my name to Shaz subconsciously in my teens because nobody could get my first name right. But I remember getting so upset when people couldn't figure it out. And I'm like, it's only 4 letters. It can't be that hard. But it wasn't that. They'd gone for 13 years or 14 years calling me Siobhan. So Siobhan to Shaz was a change. And it wasn't even, I literally changed it because I figured people could get it right. And, but people had to learn that change. And I think that's what everybody has to understand with the whole identity, gender identity, is it's not just the person going through the change that needs to understand this. It's the people around them, but the person going through it needs to understand the loss that their friends, family, and loved ones are also experiencing during this transitional phase.
Yes, I mean, I experience a kind of, I'm always in sort of 2 minds around this, because as a therapist, I'm struck that part of my process is really to kind of facilitate a space in which there is a validation and an affirming of perception, right? So there's also something around that if somebody is struggling, for example, with the fact that their family is not taking up their newfound pronouns, or they're not newfound, but they're kind of established and now identified with pronouns or naming, or their name, and kind of characteristically go back to their dead name, which is, kind of terms often referred to one's previous name that you don't identify with. That in that, I think in that process, I can also understand how in actually now kind of finding a name that resonates for you, that you feel captures and encapsulates who you are, that the need for that to be recognized and for that to be seen and for that to be acknowledged, I almost want to say it's a little bit like my sense is that it's a little bit like being a plant that it's been undernourished and is thirsting for water. You get that water and you want to sort of take it in. And so I am struck that there are times where I find myself really wanting to validate that's it is difficult and it does feel painful. And I guess, again, it's like, when you operate in binaries, then we kind of can go, well, you should understand, or, it's either, there's either a right or a wrong way of doing this. And I think the point also, and I think inherent in what you're saying, the point is that it's really not that simple. And there are a multitude of responses and reactions, and sometimes also in the processing. And I think also because I think there's a very real, along with the fear of what it means to kind of become, sort of align your external, your gender expression with your internal gender identity, and reaching towards mechanisms and whether that's a name, whether that's how you dress, that allow for greater congruence. I think there's also fear and trepidation, but there's also an excitement in that, because even if the excitement is anxiety provoking, it still lets you know that you're alive. We want to know that we're alive in some way, right? So I think there is something around, I guess, when I think about like parental reactions or friends who may respond negatively, I'm also struck that there is something to work around some of the fears that families may hold as well. So, the fear around that my child may be discriminated against, or stigma that kind of still continues to exist, and I think is still quite strong actually, around sort of othering any diverse identity that doesn't quite match heteronormative sort of constructs. So I think there's a complex set of reactions that are going on. And it's so interesting, because when you use those examples of I'll never be able to walk my daughter down the aisle, for example, I was thinking to myself, but who says? Because of course that's a binary definition in and of itself. So you could walk your son down the aisle, why not? But it's because we have these internalized sort of injunctions around how we need to be in society. So father walks his daughter down the aisle. He doesn't walk his son down the aisle. That's not what is done. So we're invited to kind of really sort of play with challenging these ideas, because of course, I think like even if you can take it away from gender, if you're struggling to think about it in terms, listeners, if they struggle to think about it in terms of gender identity, just think about oneself and how we as selves, we manifest in so many different ways, and how I manifest in one space. I mean, of course, I have these characteristics that are fairly enduring and consistent, but in some spaces where I feel safer, other parts of me come out and come to life. Other parts are maybe more concealed. And what I conceal probably says something about how I'm concerned about how others might receive me or experience me, or whether they will accept or not accept me. I fear I may have gone a bit off topic, so I apologize for that. But
no, it's all on topic. But I did learn a new term, dead name. Is that a term? Like, I've never heard that before. Learning new things all the time, I think, with these shows. But yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I did want to ask, I mean, before we go into, so one is we have gender identity, and then we have gender identity disorder. But before I go into that one, are there any factors that influence gender identity?
I mean, it's an interesting question, because I think that that when we talk about the factors influencing, there is kind of typically, I think there's biology, and then there are also social and environmental factors, right? And so prenatally, there are biological factors like your exposure to hormones, which are obviously also determined by chromosomes in the womb, and plays a huge role in shaping a child's kind of physical development, or a fetus's physical development. So, of course, boys and girls are born with distinctive sexual organs, and this becomes further differentiated when secondary sexual characteristics emerge upon puberty. And so we kind of understand that, but we also need to understand again, and I hate to say it again, but a binary view of sex fails to also capture its complexity, because not only are we know that male and female bodies now, we know that they're a lot more complex than most sort of kind of realized, and that there are also bodies that fit into neither category. So, we're often taught that there are these kind of male and female bodies, but then there's the interesting kind of manifestation of sort of intersex traits that sort of demonstrate that sex exists across a continuum of possibilities, right? And so this is why that's useful just to think about, is just in terms of some of these kind of natural versus not so natural sort of manifestations of subjectivity, is that just there's even biological variation in and of itself. So it should dispel this very simplistic notion that there are just two sexes, right? And there's a lot of research that also increasingly points to the fact that our brains also play a key role in how we experience our gender as well. So, it's not just about one's kind of sexual assigned sex at birth, but also from the sort of parental and kind of social environmental factors. Obviously, you've got parents and they label and react towards a child, as we said, on the basis of their assigned sex. So, and bodies, of course, are also gendered in the context of cultural expectations, right? So we have these kind of social labeling, and little girls often put in pink. Thank goodness that's, I think, being challenged by a lot of people, and little boys dressed in blue, and so these labels that become quite problematic. Children's interests, their preferences, behaviors, their self-concepts, very much influenced by parental and authority figure teachings regarding kind of sexual gender stereotypes, sexual stereotypes, gender stereotypes. And so we're taught that there are certain traits or activities that are appropriate or inappropriate for us to engage as little girls or little boys, and we internalize this, and we can be influenced by these teachings in later life. And we also learn through observation and imitation of what we see our primary caregivers doing. So we tend to imitate and internalize what we see, and we repeat those patterns in our own lives. And if there isn't space in which parents and adults and school authority figures, for example, are providing less stereotyped, kind of more androgynous models for behaving, what are children going to do? And practically also in our environment, the world is assigned, we assign lots of things gender, right? So like toys and colors and clothes, and just have to look at kids' clothing sections or toy sections, toys, and often in shops are sort of categorized according to little girls' toys or little boys' toys. So we have these cultural sort of expectations that are entrenched, and it can then be very difficult to imagine things in another way. So of course your gender identity also develops around the possibilities that you're given to language what it means to assume a particular kind of gender identity. Yeah.
I love the way that you put that. There is a lot of things that biologically could make the difference. There's a lot of social factors, family factors, and stuff that we as people tend to internalize. Now, would those kind of things that, as a person that is kind of exploring their identity, those things that they've internalized, would these be factors that could lead to almost a identity disorder or gender dysphoria, where you just don't quite feel right, but you're not sure how to fix it because this is what you've been told is right all your life and you've internalized that? Same example, mom walks his son, dad walks his daughter down the aisle. We all know that this is and it's entrenched in us. So would these kind of things that we've entrenched and just embodied and sucked in be something that then causes an identity crisis or disorder or even dysphoria?
Yes, well, I think very much so. I think that what we internalize and what we believe to be, I guess, also valued what we understand as normal, what we understand as kind of being sanctioned by the world around us. If we don't align with that, or if we have also internalized these very particular rules around how we need to be, the generally the kind of growing the sense that I get from a lot of my clients that I work with is that there is this kind of sort of marked kind of lack of congruence or dissonance between sort of how I feel and how I subjectively sort of align myself, and then a lot around kind of what the world is mirroring to me as being kind of normal, okay, acceptable. So yes, because of course, you know, gender dysphoria is very much a state of feeling as if, you know, there's a deep sense of mismatch between how I feel inside and then how I'm told that I need to be read on the outside, or how I need to kind of take up space or take up this role that I have as, you know, a boy or a girl or a man or a woman or a son or a daughter.
Yeah, I really like how this conversation is going, and I mean, it's quite a deep conversation. I mean, just from the, you know, from the outset, and I think Claire, on your side, I mean, it must have been quite interesting working with the first batch of patients, you know, as they kind of coming through, you know, your practice. But how do you know? I mean, like, unless someone is actually saying, you know, I'm actually going through this, and I'm talking not from a therapist point of view, but more from a, you know, a family around the person, or a friend circle or community around the person. How do you know someone is struggling with from a gender identity perspective?
Oh, you know, I think that can be quite difficult, because I think that at times I'm struck that some individuals may really kind of express, you know, express a sense of discomfort or a sense of disease. I think because of a lot of the stigma that is often attached, or the fears around what it means to come out, I think often what ends up manifesting more on the outside, what is more visible, is someone who may be grappling with severely lowered mood, anxiety, perhaps a withdrawal or retreat from sort of previously sort of, you know, interpersonal social circles, for example. I think also that there could also be a kind of a sense that somebody is increasingly expressing dissatisfaction with something about how they are, you know, like a discomfort, for example, teenagers as they start to develop, from a sort of puberty perspective. So discomfort with developing breasts, or, you know, discomfort with hormonal changes, and a desire to kind of conceal or hide. I'm struck that it's quite challenging at times though as well, because, you know, a teen experiencing some dysphoria in relation to changes in their body may not necessarily be experiencing gender dysphoria, for example. You know, so I think for me, what becomes important is to really stay very curious and express concern, you know, because if you notice that somebody is withdrawing or retreating, or there's a shift in their behavior, it's irritable or impatient, generally somebody is letting you know that something is amiss. And so often in society, I think we tend to, and I hate to again generalize, but I feel like in South African society, we're quite good at also sort of kind of keeping going and not wanting to disturb and not wanting to kind of impose, or, you know, we're quite, I think we have these sort of wonderful contrasts where we can be quite sort of forthright and quite direct and tell people what we think of them, and, you know, but then there's this other part that seems to be quite invested in being sort of, you know, it's not our business, it's kind of, you know, don't want to invade your space. But I think that if one is aware that somebody is manifesting in ways that are markedly different from how you've experienced them in the past, it's letting you know that there's something that is amiss, and that we can be curious. And even just around sort of opening up space around, you know, I see things, you know, you come across as quite, there's something different, and I'm worried about you. you're not ready to talk about it now, that's okay, but I'm letting you know that I'm here. That's a bit of a vague answer, though, I think. I'm sorry about that.
No problem. I think as a topic, this is probably one of the more complicated ones we've ever covered. So I think any insight that you can pass on to us is amazing. But I do want to go back to that disorder one, and I'm not sure if I missed it. But when does it actually become a disorder then? Is there a certain link to that? I mean, and I don't know if this is a DSM-5 kind of thing or not, but when is it gender identity and when is it gender identity disorder?
So it's interesting because, of course, the medicalization of transgender identities and gender identity kind of related to stress, it's quite a controversial topic, right? And it's mostly because there are concerns about further stigmatization of an already marginalized group, right? And so often earlier theories would conflate kind of homosexuality with transgender identities and took this pathologizing view towards gender nonconformity. But the DSM-4, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, so that the DSM-4, we now use the DSM-5. The DSM-4 referred to gender identity, to strong cross-gender identification and a persistent unease with one's sex. And the diagnosis becomes disordered because it produced marked distress or impairment in one or more areas of life. But the DSM-5 has changed that quite significantly to referring more to, well, not more to, changing the gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. So what it does is it really kind of tries to rather sort of not establish the sort of presence of gender variance as if it's a pathology, but that the dysphoria, the distress caused by kind of body and mind and subjective sort of experience of self, and then sort of societal constructions of sex or your assigned sex, and then that it's more referring to the lack of alignment around that, and also societal marginalization that may take place. So the idea is that now, if we're going to talk about a diagnosis, then there needs to be a level that is a level of experience of self as being kind of, there's an ego dystonic quality to it. So in other words, it feels incongruent. There is a dissonance of sorts. So yeah, so it's kind of, and there's a set of criteria as well. I don't know if you want me to go through those, but there's a set of criteria which typically kind of, when talking about gender dysphoria, what one then kind of looks for.
If you have that on hand, that would be amazing because it closes it up completely. If not, we can add it to the show notes. So completely up to you.
I can. I mean, it's basically gender dysphoria would then obviously be described as this kind of lack of gender congruence that could be described as an absence of experiencing comfort in our body as it relates to our gender. Just hang on, sorry, I just need to, I've got it written down because cool. I don't have exact criteria and I just want to get, okay, so basically this official diagnostic sort of criteria would be a marked incongruence between one's expressed or experienced gender and assigned gender of at least 6 months duration, and it needs to be manifested by at least 2 or more of the following. So the DSM lacks specifics and it lacks categorization. So a marked incongruence between one's, as I've said already, the expressing experienced gender and primary or secondary sex characteristics, or in young adolescents, the anticipated secondary sex characteristics. So in other words, some incongruence around what may be coming up in terms of puberty and anticipated hormonal changes. A strong desire to be rid of one's primary or secondary sex characteristics because of this marked incongruence. A strong desire for primary and or secondary sex characteristics of the other gender. A strong desire to be of the other gender, or some alternative gender different from one's assigned gender, a strong desire to be treated as the other gender, or again, some alternative gender different from one's assigned gender, and then a strong conviction that one has the typical feelings and reactions of the other gender or alternative gender different from one's assigned gender. And it has to also create clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning.
Thanks. I know there was a lot, and I think it's probably over most of our heads, but I think it's worth just, like even if you play this out, in half speed or something, just worth knowing what that is. But I think that always helps, but yeah, I like how the DSM-5 always puts it in months as well. You have to wait for 6 months, and then actually it's a thing, which is quite cool. Yeah, but
well, I struggle with that. I mean, I must say, like, it's a guide. And then, of course, as with anything, I mean, I'm really not actually, I can honestly say that I have never assigned the diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Like, I like to work with it in other words, I don't think of it as a diagnostic category. I think of it as a phenomenological experience. And if I can unpack that as a phenomenological experience of oneself in the world, as opposed to a disorder or a diagnostic category, sometimes, I mean, I think it depends also on the person you're working with. Some people really appreciate and want to have something that they can attach, like it's a scaffolding. It allows them to kind of orient themselves in some ways. Other people don't want that kind of labeling. And so I tend to really meet people where they're at, and you get a sense of, of what is valued or what feels kind of appropriate to the space that you're working with.
Yeah, I said that obviously tongue in cheek, the 6
I know.
But it's always interesting for me. And I think just closing up the disorder one, it's like, it obviously is, if it's a problem and if you're experiencing that, then it becomes that. I just feel sorry for, anyone trying to look at the diagnosis, like in the last few years, since COVID, we see lots of insurance companies, asking for reports from, like especially psychologists in terms of the effects of depression and stuff like that. I mean, I think, as a world, it's interesting to see how we're going to go into, because, this creates its own, like, I wouldn't say issues, but its own, perceptions, around how people react in society and stuff like that. We saved our last question to be the most difficult, which is sorry?
Can I just, there's just one point that I would like to make, which I think is quite important, which is that, depression and anxiety obviously have their own classifications as kind of mood disorders. And I think we need to be very careful as well around sort of holding in mind that, when we're talking about disorder, I think when you feel like you don't have an established sense of place in the world, or you feel like your authentic sense of self cannot be fully recognized, isn't that quite a disordered place to be? It's quite chaotic, right? So it's a chaotic place to be in. And so we need to also understand that then the comorbid or the accompanying experiences of that, the emotional impact, the psychological impact of that in the form of depressed mood or anxiety, that these can also be understood as very normal reactions to a very abnormal set of circumstances. And that then utilizing kind of that, yes, one can kind of diagnostically refer to depressed mood or a major depressive episode, but we also need to appreciate that this manifestation of lowered mood may not necessarily be a clinical syndrome as such, but it is a very understandable expression of somebody who is feeling like all of who they are is not fully nourished, or that they cannot express that fully. And I just really want to make that point as well, if we're talking about diagnosis.
Yeah. I loved how you said that. I mean, it's actually, we take excerpts from the episodes, and that's definitely something I would definitely keep, to explain it. So thanks for doing that. Going back to the question that I was talking about is, if we know someone going through gender identity, or even if you suspect, how do we help them as loved ones or a community around them?
Gosh, I think that one of the things that is really, really, really important is to really listen to somebody and trust their experience. So, if somebody's coming to you and they are disclosing to you that, that they think they may be transgender, or that they are grappling with their gender identity, that when they're sharing their story with you, it's a sign, I think, of also trust, that they trust you enough to share something that is so fundamentally important to them. And their experience might not be what you expect, but it's important that there's no right way to be trans, there's no wrong way or right way to transition. Every story is unique. And so I think sometimes when people also tell us these things, we grapple with the difference between kind of our personal reactions and then also how this person is also experiencing this telling. And if we can really just pay attention to the language that somebody is using, the only way to know how someone truly identifies is to listen to how they talk about themselves. So you don't necessarily need to know all the terms related to kind of other gender identities, and because they are multiple, to be supportive. You need to respect, try to use the language that your friend or loved one prefers. If somebody has a preferred pronoun, or they have chosen a name that they, to really kind of, if you can, to really sort of to attempt to mirror and utilize the language that is being used, and I think also it's okay to, I think what is important is, and I think we spoke about it earlier, is that it's also okay to have a mixture of feelings about this, right? So learning that someone is transgender can bring up a lot of feelings, and especially if it's a close family member like a child or a parent. And it's okay to have those feelings. It's also important that you find the support that you need to kind of sort through that and to understand your own experience, because somebody who's going through that transition or is starting to explore and question their gender identity may not be able to be the support person for you. And also, I think what we sometimes do is, when we're wanting to know more or we don't know enough, we want to a little bit kind of sort of hope that the other may educate us around, kind of their experience. And they may not be in a place where they have the energy or the resources even to do that work for us. And in fact, we can. There's so many resources available that we can explore, we can educate ourselves, we can connect with supportive communities. I know Triangle Project is a really lovely project that offers support to gender variant sort of forms of expression, and also, of course, ensuring that if somebody that is grappling with gender identity, that you can direct them towards sort of sources of support, whether that be an organization, for example, whether that be a therapist, whether that be even just reminding them or kind of going through with them, identifying particular friends who they identify as being a lot more empathic and a lot more kind of expansive and engaging, and who may really be wonderful sources of support. So there's quite, and I guess also practicing a kind of allyship as well. So I think this also depends, again, where we are in the process, but being an ally around sort of consistently noticing and challenging transphobia and also ignorance both in ourselves, because I even working with identity, I do have to acknowledge that I have subtly internalized my own constructions around identity. So always checking oneself. And you can check yourself as well with the person you're talking with, but also not to make that their responsibility to sort out for you. So, that kind of the sense that they are needing to soothe you in what you might be struggling with.
I like how you said that. On that last bit, we had someone and we spoke about, I think, bereavement or death. And, or disenfranchised grief, I think it was, with Benet Otto. And she just said, how would, and I liked how she said that. She said, how would you like me, like, how would you like, us, like, to go through this, and, and to the grieving one. I thought that's a good way to look at it as well. It's like asking the other person, how would you
Yes.
like me to,
Yes.
like, help you with something,
Yes.
something that's so small, but, like, we hardly think of it. We always think of our own issues, and obviously with good reason, self-preservation and stuff like that. But it's always asking the other person, how would you want me to do? How would you want me to address you? All of those kind of things.
I think that's it's a lovely invitation to really to kind of engaging in with the respect and with the curiosity. So the curiosity to get to know, because ultimately I get the feeling that as human beings, we're not looking for people to necessarily completely align with or feel completely 100% comfortable, but we are looking for them to be curious enough to challenge the things that might make them feel uncomfortable, to, like you say, ask for guidance around, how would you like to go about this? What, and how would you like me to respond? But I think also we go into, so I think often is when we hit a sense of crisis, and I'm not framing this necessarily as crisis, but I think in a moment where you have perhaps a strong reaction or strong emotional response, go into that kind of mode of to do, where we want to sort things out and we want to help and we want to, whereas kind of really just sort of the point is to really kind of, that one may not have to do anything. One may just need to be in a very mindful, open and empathic way. Listen and attend. Yeah. And attune.
Yeah, my wife got me in the early years to definitely understand that concept. You don't have to solve every problem, just like listen. But I think I love that. Shez, I think, I think the topic has been amazing. The conversation has been great. To close off, Shez, anything on your side?
No, I think we've covered the topic really nicely, and we've looked at it from different angles, which I think was the most important thing to get out of this show, was that there are so many identities to look at, but there's also so many different ways to look at how somebody is going through this, how you can help them, but more importantly, how you can help the extended people around somebody who is going through an identity, gender identity situation. So thank you, Claire. I think this has been absolutely phenomenal, and I'm really hoping it can help a lot of people.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed the discussion. It's been really lovely. Thank you.
And Claire, on your side, the last question I was going to ask is, obviously we try our best to put an outline out and try to understand the topic, but being someone that works in the field quite a lot, and obviously with many patients, is there anything around this topic that we probably missed, that you thought, it would have been nice if we asked you this?
I think one of the things that, no, I don't know that immediately there's a lot that comes to mind. I think what I'm struck by is that there will always be something that is missed or not covered, because I think also by its nature, it's just an ever evolving topic. Just the fact that we, I think you asked the question in your outline around, how many gender identities or something along, how many are there? And that is just so very, very broad. And, there are obviously the more theoretical kind of established ones, but, so I'm struck that it is just so very complex. And it's also deeply kind of individualized and personal. And, there's so much. So I think it's difficult to cover everything. I do think that one of the things that I guess I am quite mindful of is that I think a lot of individuals grappling with gender identity are also really sort of, I think, feeling quite isolated and knowing how to reach out or what to access in terms of support. And I guess I just think in the South African context, it's quite difficult because therapy is still quite an elitist enterprise. And so in that sense, I'm struck that it's not always as accessible to everybody. And I just think that what is available to us and what I notice clients really do sort of find quite valuable. It's not necessarily that ideal because it's not in person, but online communities. So kind of online communities. I know Twitter has quite a lot of active sort of groups that kind of activate support and advocate for support. And I've found some clients have kind of explored some quite novel sort of spaces and found them quite valuable. And so my feeling is that to really, I think with COVID as well, the global environment has become a lot smaller or a lot sort of, and certainly people find those kinds of sources of support very valuable. But of course, there's also certainly outside of the world, we have Triangle, which is also a valuable resource to access. Just in terms of identifying possible sort of peer, even just a peer counselor or a community, an empathic community, because that's what we also want to be able to mobilize for ourselves and for people, empathic communities of individuals who have a sense of what the experience of grappling with gender identity feels like, is like, so that it can normalize, that as humans, we thrive on connection and attachment. And I'm struck that often that sense of connection and attachment can experience quite significant disruption in this process. And so mobilizing that is very, very important.
I love that. So the world is definitely a better place with people like yourself, Claire, that almost like, and that's what we want to get out of this, is that at least if someone is struggling with this and they're listening to this episode, they said, actually, I could reach out to someone like Claire or Claire herself and help me at least with the initial stages. And then, like you said, the community is amazing. So thanks very much for what you do. Thanks for agreeing to be on this, on the show with us and talking about this amazing topic.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire.
Pleasure, Shaz. Thank you very much for having me. It's been really lovely.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening. As always, stay tuned and we'll speak to you in the next episode.